Thank you very much, dear colleagues. My name is Danijel Vojak. I come from the Institute of Social Sciences Ivo Pilar here in Zagreb. I'm a historian. I've been dealing with the history of Roma for the past 10 years, especially their history in the period since the 19th century. We've just heard about the discrimination. We know that there is a wide range of causes of this difficult position of Roma. We could talk, if we have some time for the discussion, about the roots of this, which go back to the 15th century here in Europe. And the first discriminatory provisions here in Croatia existed as early as in the 17th century. So this situation, unfortunately, has continued all till today. My narrow topic for today is my research of the Holocaust against the Roma and their ensuing discrimination, which has lasted until these days. Generally speaking, Holocaust and genocide, or porjamos, this is the term I prefer. The term Holocaust is not really appropriate, but we can nonetheless talk about the context of what happened in the Second World War. The German Nazi concept was unfortunately also applied to the Roma national minority, to the attempts to eradicate them by murdering them, sterilizing them, and so on, all in an attempt to protect the racial purity of one people. Roma were among the first victims in Europe of this German concept, which was then taken over by many European states and European nations. They even competed among them as to who will be more brutal in the way in which they implemented them. Just a few words about the Croatian case. Given that I am a historian from Croatia, I will not burden you with data, but I can possibly tell you some things that you didn't know about the misfortunes of Roma in Croatia. The Ustashi regime took over the Nazi practice, and they had the act against Tsigani threat. The goal was to have a pure, ethnically pure Croatian area. Just a few weeks after the establishment of the so-called independent state of Croatia, different pieces of legislation were adopted, including the legislation on the protection of the Aryan blood and so on. Then specific decisions were also adopted by the Ministry of the Interior, all this under the strict patronage of the German authorities. There was also an order on collecting and deporting Roma to the concentration camp Jasenovac and other concentration camps. At the same time, systematic looting of Roma settlements started. So maybe just one piece of data. My research shows that before the war, in 1939, there were some 15,000 Roma in Croatia who declared themselves as Roma. And in 1946, in the first post-war census, there were just over 400 of them. So this is just one illustrative piece of data. After the Second World War, we had the occurrence that we shouldn't have had, and this is that the Holocaust was forgotten. in a book called Bury Me Standing, the author said that Roma created an art out of what happened to them during the Second World War. Unlike the Jews, for example, who went much further in preserving the memory and making sure the memory of the Second World War. So the question is whether the Roma themselves can be somewhat blamed for the fact that their Holocaust in the Second World War has been forgotten. After the Second World War, they were continuously discriminated against in different fields of education, employment, social position, and so on. So the problems with the lack of political organization, marginalized position, and so on, made it possible for them to be treated in this way. Anti-fascist winning sides after the Second World War did not use any witnesses in the Nuremberg trials. Some scientists, like Martin Clayton and others, say that among the Roma, the few Roma who survived the war, that among them the silence prevailed after the war as a way of them coping with their trauma. The Roma intelligence simply disappeared in many pits in which bodies were dumped. And this is why among the Roma after the Second World War there were no people who could write about what had happened to their co-nationals. At the same time, the official governments of European states were also silent. They never apologized for what happened, let alone provide any restitution for the damage that they suffered. And there was probably a footnote somewhere in the historical scientific publications concerning the Roma, only in the context of what happened to the Jewish people. So many scientists believe that Roma were sort of collateral damage, that they simply happened to be there and that they were not the primary target of the Nazi movement. And there are many representatives, famous representatives of this position. And the prevailing opinion is that the Jewish Holocaust was unique, while at the same time the eradication of Roma has been forgotten about, including the Holocaust against handicapped people, those that were killed, destroyed during the Second World War simply because they had a certain handicap rather than because of their beliefs or anything else. Also, there are certain so-called historians, revisionists, as we know, something really appalling, who deny what had happened, or that the Holocaust as such even happened. The situation in world history only started to happen in 1980s with the new knowledge about what had happened to the Roma in the Second World War. But the main memory of that Holocaust has been lost. The European countries and German countries eventually recognized what had happened to the Roma, whereas back in 50s and 60s, German authorities refused to recognize Roma as the victims and refused to pay any restitution to them. It was only in 1980s that this process began, and it is still ongoing. Later in the discussion, we can also address the situation in other countries. Regardless of this lack of memory of the Porajmos, the Roma International Congress in 2009 proposed to the Council of Europe to mark the Roma International Day of Memory of the Roma victims of Porajmos. They selected the 2nd of August as that day of commemoration, to commemorate the day when some 4,000 Roma were killed in Auschwitz. So the general awareness is slowly shifting. The world is slowly recognizing what happened to the Roma. We celebrated or commemorated this day for the first time this year in Croatia as well. So in a conclusion, I would like to stimulate the discussion by saying the following. The academia needs to cooperate with different organizations and institutions, and finally needs to start participating in the research of what happened to the Roma in the Second World War, and thus pay tribute to the Roma victims with the message that we all need to be repeating, never to happen again, never to be repeated again. It is necessary to carry out proper research of the Second World War and the suffering of the Roma. We need to link different institutions and individuals involved in this, and as a consequence of this research, we need to change the paradigm, the discourse, and the perception in the public. We need to change the so-called forgotten Holocaust. We need to mark all the places in which Roma suffered or in which Roma were killed. We need to have a public debate about the extent of this suffering and the consequences of this suffering, which are still felt by the Roma community. Within this context, jointly with other relevant institutions and individuals, we need to prevent the so-called anti-gypsy movement, which is ever more evident in different countries of Europe, and we need to prevent historical revisionism, which still exists, for example, also in Croatia. So a proper scientific research would enable us to ensure that the Roma Holocaust is never repeated. Thank you.